Hello, everyone. It is Allison Moon here with a special Patreon exclusive quickie. Today, I wanted to talk about sex positivity as a movement and as an idea and some of the controversy around it. The reason why I came up with this idea for a episode was because I recently got into a conversation, enthusiastic debate, I suppose, around the concept of sex positivity. And this was on Facebook, of course, because that's where we have all of the most intelligent discourse in our society. But it was in a professional group, and it was a group for female identified and non-binary identified journalists. And the original prompt, the original post was that there was a woman who wanted to write up an article about how sex positivity is failing young women by encouraging them to push themselves beyond their comfort zone and engage in more sex with more people than they actually want to. And the way that she had phrased it, it sounded very much like she was blaming sex positivity for convincing young women to put themselves in unsafe or unhealthy situations. And I had to push back on the concept because I felt like that was a fundamental misunderstanding of sex positivity. But I think it's a very common misunderstanding of sex positivity as exemplified by other people commenting on the same thing, one of whom basically got very aggressive with me, suggesting that I was encouraging young women to exploit themselves. And in that conversation, I obviously became very frustrated, but I realized that there were some serious misunderstandings about what sex positivity is and where it came from. So I want to talk a little bit about that and then where I think we need to do better as sex educators, as sex positive creators, to push back against some of the myths. So, a little bit of a basic, right? So, sex positivity is a movement, and it was the term most people believe was coined by William Reich in the 1920s. And he was describing different societies and how some societies consider sex a force of good within communities, and some societies see sex as a force of darkness or ill, right? So the very basic was that, he was looking at some kind of these macro level, like how society views sex. And of course, we can look at our own society in Western culture, American culture, where I'm speaking from, and say, yeah, America has a very sex negative culture. Any of us can look at just the world that we are in and say, hey, like there we have a lot of negative messaging about what sex is. So sex positivity came out as a response to sex negative culture. It was an attempt to kind of reset our cultural understanding of what sex is, what it does, and what it can be used for in society. So, one of the primary definitions often used, I think, is kind of the source of one of some of the misunderstandings around sex positivity. A very common definition that you'll often see is that sex positivity is a belief that all consensual sex is healthy. Now, this is a very limiting, very undeveloped definition. It's a very bare bones basic to try and get people at least on the side of understanding the positive forces of sex. But you could probably imagine why there's so many issues with this definition, particularly when we talk about how people are interpreting it. Because we think, oh, well, if all consensual sex is healthy, then the more I have of it, the healthier I will be, right? The idea is that health is an extension of quantity or of just engagement with something. And the reason why this is, I think, so destructive is that we can look at this from a perspective of anything else in our society, and it's pretty obvious why this is a problem. The example that I often use is food, right? So food is a good thing. We need it to live. A lot of our social lives, a lot of our pleasure is centered around food and food rituals, right? And and that's generally accepted in our society. Nobody looks at you weird for going to a restaurant or going to a different restaurant every night. They might be jealous that you have enough money to be able to do that, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of shame of that. Now, there is shame when it comes to gluttony, of course. We have a lot of problems in our society around fat phobia. But for the most part, we see food as fundamentally healthy, fundamentally good to engage with. And the variety therein, the different ways that people like to do food, it's all fine, right? However, food can be unhealthy as well, right? Eating too much of it, eating the wrong kinds of it, having an unhealthy relationship to it. Food is fundamentally a good thing, but it can be used in bad ways and it can be pathologized in its own ways as well, right? With sex, we are not starting from a fundamentally neutral place. We're starting from a fundamentally negative place. A society that says sex will kill you, sex is dangerous, sex is evil, sex is a way that people oppress women. It's not okay to engage in sex outside of monogamous marriage, right? You're not allowed to control your own fertility. If you take money for having sex, you're a bad person. All of these different stories around sexuality that are so integrated into who we are as a society that it's very hard for us to get to a place where we just see sex as a neutral thing, as a tool that can be wielded in any number of ways. And so the sex positivity movement was an attempt to pull us back to a neutral place, to say, hey, yes, sex can be used in these ways. Yes, sex can be exploitative. Yes, sex can be painful or harmful. However, it also has all this potential to be affirming and engaging and building community and building intimacy and all these wonderful things. So we talk about those things to try and help kind of undo some of the negative messaging around our sex negative culture. But that definition, that very basic definition I quoted, doesn't hold space for that because it says all sex is healthy, which isn't true. It's not true. It's like saying all food is healthy. Not true. Most of it is. If you use it right, it is. In moderation, it can be. Even bad foods can be fine in certain ways, right? But to say that all sex is healthy is a trap. Now, I want to just kind of add a little bit of a caveat here because the definition that all consensual sex is fundamentally healthy comes from a sex educator named Elena Gabosh. And Elena Gabosh is an elder in our community, and she was very fundamental in bringing sex positivity and sex positive culture to Seattle specifically, Seattle, Washington. She started a center for sex positive culture. She's a teacher. She's wonderful, and I consider her a peer and a colleague. And kind of in a very weird, brutal, universal twist, I was engaged in this conversation just 2 days ago on Facebook, and I referenced Elena. I had not talked about her in a long time. And then this morning I woke up to news that Elena is on her deathbed. As I record this, she is currently dying. She's been sick for a while, but it was just a very weird moment to have that happen after I had just kind of invoked her name in a number of different ways. And I'm saying all of this just because I want to honor who she is and how she's contributed to sex positive culture as I discuss why that definition is problematic. And this is not at all meant to be a takedown of her as a woman or as a person or as an elder. This is just me engaging with her ideas, right? So I very much want to honor who she is as a woman. So that definition is problematic, to be clear. It's also repeated a lot because it's very succinct. Now, there's another definition that sounds very similar, but there is a key difference. So I'm going to read that one to you, and I want you to try and spot the difference. All right. So the first definition, again, was that the sex positivity is the belief that all consensual sex is fundamentally healthy. This next definition says, sex positivity is the idea that all sex, as long as it is healthy and explicitly consensual, is a positive thing. So in a very kind of mathematical way, let's just remove the terms consensual because those are now givens. Both definitions include consensual as a necessary state for sex positivity. Okay, so understanding that that's the case. Again, definition 1, all sex is healthy. Definition 2, all healthy sex is good. Spot the difference? It's pretty important. It's actually a pretty operative difference using that word healthy, right? Because in definition 1, it says all sex is healthy, such that sex itself is considered to be a fundamental good thing, right? Whereas in the second definition, healthy is a modifier of sex in order for it to be good. So healthy equals good. as opposed to sex equals healthy. Now, this a definition. Now, this difference in definition, while it is minor, is so absolutely important because I believe that the second definition is far more utilitarian and far more encompassing of the diversity of sexual experience. We have to say that like what is healthy for an individual is going to be different from person to person, right? Healthy sex for me is going to look very different from healthy sex for you, for my partner, for my friends, for my parents, right? Because for me, I know what I like, I know my body, and I know how I want to engage with my body with other people. And if you were to choose to engage with your body in the way that I do with mine, you might be using the wrong user guide. You might be using the wrong set of instructions for sexuality because what is healthy for me is not healthy for everyone. And again, kind of the food metaphor, right? Like this, it's this idea that nutrition is different for everybody. Yes, there are some foundational things that we all know that we need to survive, but I cannot necessarily have the same diet as my partner or as my parents or as my siblings and still find myself as healthy as they would be, right? We need to fine tune our choices based on what we truly believe to be healthy. And that often comes from a place of an inner, like a listening to one's own self, to a thoughtful interrogation of one's preferences, and to the intentional, thoughtful exploration of boundaries, desires, and choice, right? And so understanding that health is different for everybody includes then, by its very nature, the diversity of the human sexual experience. Because if I cannot, like for me, sex with people of all genders is fundamentally healthy for me. But for a very clearly homosexual or very clearly heterosexual person to force themselves to engage in sex with somebody of a gender that actually they find repellent would be fundamentally unhealthy, right? To engage from another example, for me, pain does not turn me on. I do not enjoy, for instance, piercing or cutting as a means of sexual pleasure, but other people genuinely do. And it would be unhealthy for me to engage in receiving piercings and cuttings as though that would be my way to find pleasure. I would never be able to force myself to enjoy it in the ways that some people enjoy it organically, right? And that's just it feels very obvious, but it's so important. And this is why the definition of using the word healthy equals positive, equals a good thing, is really important for us to understand. Okay, so why do people get this wrong? Well, so people use the first definition, all sex is good. And then they, again, by that nature of that basic definition, assume that more sex must be better. More sex with different people must be good. So if I'm going to be good at having sex or a good sexual citizen, I have to force myself beyond my own comfort zone, beyond my own safety, beyond my own boundaries to engage. Now, where I get nitpicky and where I got on my high horse in this conversation on Facebook is that I believe that is a fundamental misunderstanding, and it is choosing the wrong enemy, right? The enemy in this scenario of maybe a young woman who feels like in order to be a good sex positive feminist, she has to force herself to have sex with people she doesn't want to have sex with, or more frequently than she wants to have sex. This is blaming that choice on sex positivity is incorrect, just fundamentally, because it's not, sex positivity is a tool, it's a response, it is a movement. It is not a set of rules, but that you have to check off in order to do a good job, right? It is a philosophy. And if you only understand the philosophy from this one very, very incomplete definition, you're missing the whole damn point, right? And in the scenario, in the way that's practically speaking, so in the example of the young woman who's choosing to have more sex than she wants to have because she thinks she has to, I very strongly doubt it's sex positive rhetoric that's telling her to do that. I would be far more convinced that it was the young men who want her to have sex with them, or who want them to have sex with his friends, or do things that she doesn't feel comfortable with, and they're using sex positivity as a weapon. They're using it, the rhetoric around sex positivity, as a tool to get what they want, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of sex positivity, because then it is ceased to be healthy, because it has ceased to be a choice that an individual is making for themselves, and is turned into a club that one wields in order to bash in the heads of people that they want to do what they want them to do, right? And in this way, the enemy is not sex positivity or sex itself. It is patriarchy. It is power. It is exploitation. It is using language in a way to make somebody be convinced of things. Now, this is not at all specific to sex. You can see this in any possible realm of imagination. When we use rhetoric of a group in order to convince people to do things that are outside of their interests, we are using it as a weapon. We're bludgeoning them with rhetoric. And that's a really dangerous thing. I mean, we can see this in religion, we can see this in warmongering, we can see this in all different ways to try and convince people to do things that are actually fundamentally unhealthy, right? It reminds me of the saying, any tool can be a weapon if you hold it right, right? Any tool can be a weapon if you wield it like a weapon, right? Sex itself is neutral. Sex positivity itself, in some ways, is neutral, but it can be misused. And that misusing is the villain in this story. Now, I think where I get again kind of cranky about this is that there are a lot of people who think that, sex positive feminists are to blame. We're not doing a good enough job of telling the story of sex positivity. And I have to push back, because literally everywhere I see sex positivity spoken about with any sort of care and thought, it moves straight from the definition into myth busting, right? The second definition that I've been using, Colorado State's definition, immediately after saying the definition, it jumps into common myths about sex positivity. And the first one is sex positivity is about having lots of sex. That is not true. And so where I got cranky in the Facebook page conversation, and I continue to get cranky, is people saying, hey, well, you guys aren't doing a good enough job of talking about women's choice or giving people tools. Whereas sex positivity has always been about sex education, age-appropriate sex education. And age-appropriate sex education is not just about how to use a condom or how not to get somebody pregnant. It's about understanding bodily sovereignty. It's about understanding that you can use touch to hurt or to heal. It's about understanding that you get to make decisions for your own body. And if that means you don't want to kiss grandma, you shouldn't have to kiss grandma, right? There's this movement towards understanding sexual consent from a very young age. We can talk about the very foundations of sexual self-awareness without actually talking about the penis and vagina situation. We can talk about, we can teach young people before they have any sort of sexual inclinations about what it means to listen to their own body and what feels good and what doesn't feel good. Again, back to food, right? We have a way of teaching people to know when they're dehydrated, for instance, or when they're hungry, right? Your body tells you, and you learn to listen to your body. But a lot of young people, they might sometimes have a hard time figuring out. I mean, I'm 37 and I sometimes forget to drink water. Let's be honest. But we learn a certain amount of body awareness, right? We learn to listen to things. And this is particularly true with food, where you eat something and it doesn't agree with you. You kind of learn to pay attention to that. Oh my gosh, maybe I have a gluten intolerance, or maybe I just really don't get along with legumes, or whatever, right? You learn to adjust your diet based on what feels good in your own body. And with some exception, we don't tend to shame people for not being able to digest things, right? I mean, it might be funny to talk about lactose intolerance, but ultimately, I'm not going to force feed somebody milk when they really don't want it, because that's completely inappropriate and also completely misunderstanding this idea of bodily sovereignty, right? And such it goes back to sex. We need to, as sexual citizens, learn to listen to what feels good. I use this term in my books, embodied yes. Learning to listen to oneself when it feels like something is working or isn't working. And the better we can get at this, the better off we are in general, because it becomes second nature. Something doesn't feel right, you can notice it, and you can open an inquiry into why or what would feel better. And the better we get at this, the better lovers we become because we are able to notice and speak up right away. Now, this is not always perfect, but this is the process. This is the yoga of learning around embodied yeses around sex, right? We learn to listen, and when we learn to listen, we learn to notice, and then we learn to interrogate, and then we learn to speak. And this is a multi-step process, and this is why I write books about this, because we're not, all of us are not necessarily perfect at this, and that's okay. And so this is where I get a little bit frustrated, is when I hear people say, well, we're not doing a good enough job. It really means that you're not paying attention, because almost everyone I know who talks about sex positivity at all talks about embodiment, talks about listening, talks about preferences, talks about learning how to understand, talks about race and capitalism and all of these complex things that all feed into sex and sex culture. And so when people say, no, you're not saying it, I have to say, I think you're wrong. I think you're not reading past the first sentence, which is unfortunately society in a lot of ways, but I think means that it creates these pat answers. It creates the wrong villain. I think it's very similar to the conversation around feminism in general, or even recently Black Lives Matter, right? There's this knee-jerk reaction that happens because of what mass media tells you to think. So around feminism, the idea that it's about feminist supremacy and separatism, as opposed to actually gender equality based on, understanding how the different genders experience society. And with Black Lives Matter, the mainstream dominant culture was suggesting that it was about Black supremacy, as opposed to raising awareness to the ways in which Black bodies are considered disposable and villainous in our society, right? But this is where it becomes really important to listen to who's speaking and listen to them with compassion and thoroughness. In some ways, the conversation around sex positivity and the way we have it also reminds me of the way we talk about sex work in our culture, and how I've noticed this happening, and I certainly hope it continues to happen. But when we talk about sex work, to talk about it as from the perspective of labor and labor rights. And this is something that a lot of, again, sex positive feminists are discussing at length. This idea that moving away from the rhetoric around, quote unquote, women selling their bodies and towards a place of labor. And we're always selling our labor because a capitalist society tells us we have no value without selling our labor. That coal miners sell their labor, and massotherapists sell their labor, and doctors sell their labor. And we have a hierarchy of what counts as okay in our culture to sell, and what counts as an appropriate amount of labor to sell. But for some reason, none of that compassion for work and the challenges of being a worker in capitalist society, none of that extends to sex, because we have so many, because again, our culture is so sex negative, we can't talk at a mainstream level about sex work as labor, because we can't get past people seeing it as just through the lens of sex negativity, through the lens of shame and disgust and fear. And again, this is why sex positivity is so necessary, because sex positivity says we have the right to investigate for ourselves what is appropriate use of our sexual labor and our sexual bodies. We have the right, and we, in many ways, have the duty to do that in order to provide a space for a more positive culture in general. So that's where I am with that today. I, as always, very much welcome your thoughts. There's so much more to say about this, but I kind of wanted to give a little bit of a primer around this belief system. Just as a kind of like a footnote to the whole thing, there is a smaller movement around talking about pleasure positivity as opposed to sex positivity to discuss that, just again, the fundamental positivity of pleasure. But again, you can pathologize this too. Again, I love eating ice cream. It gives me pleasure. But if I did it too much, it would be harmful to my body. It would be harmful to my mind, right? Even though ultimately it still would give me maybe a pleasure on this very neurological level, there's something on the back end that could be harmful. And I want to talk about this. I want to examine how we pathologize otherwise neutral things like sex, like pleasure, like food, like art. These things themselves have no inherent value, no, and I mean like charge, no positive or negative charge, no positive or negative value. These are just entities. What creates the positive or negative experience is how they're wielded. So, to the degree that we can all choose to wield these things with positivity, choose to wield these things with grace, joy, and compassion, I encourage us to continue to do this and continue to encourage our communities to do this as well, and to interrogate where we might be using these things as weapons as opposed to as tools. Thanks so much again for your support. You really have made me feel okay and safe taking a break from the main podcast while still being able to engage with interesting ideas with interesting people. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your ongoing support. It really means so much, and it does make a huge difference in my day to day. And I'm not even kidding, in my mental health. I have been dealing with a lot lately, personally, as I talked about in my last little Patreon update. But most importantly, I've been dealing with a lot of new stuff coming through from a couple days ago as well. I've had a lot of people target me on social media lately because my book Girl Sex 101 is trans inclusive. That is to say, I talk about penises, and I talk about girls with penises, and I think that that's an important thing to do. And I've had a lot of people call me a lot of horrible things on the internet lately. So to have a venue like Patreon, where I know that I can speak to listeners, and I know that you are hearing me not from this very, again, 280 characters, but you're listening with intention and kindness and compassion, really means the world to me, because I think that I don't feel like I have a lot of spaces to do that these days, and I have a feeling a lot of people don't. But this is one of those places, and you are one of those people. So thank you for listening, and thank you for engaging with these ideas with compassion and enthusiasm. And I, as always, welcome your feedback and thoughts. And certainly, if you have any things you'd like me to talk about, or if you've been wrestling with any ideas that you would like me to engage with, please, by all means, reach out. Leaving a comment on this or just sending me a message on Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks so much again, and I will hope to be back to talk to you again soon. Bye.